Discovering Alabama is a production of the Alabama Museum of Natural History.
That soft call up there is the sound of an endangered species, the red-cockaded woodpecker. It's hard to believe that a little elusive bird should be the subject of major conflict across the Southeast. But the issues surrounding the red-cockaded woodpecker have often pitted environmentalists against those in the region's multi-million-dollar timber industry. To survive, the red-cockaded woodpecker requires a certain kind of forest habitat that has declined significantly, in part due to our demand for timber products. Today, some of the last forest areas harboring this woodpecker are in Alabama. How did this species become endangered? What measures are needed to protect it? And why the conflict between interest groups? I'm Doug Phillips. Join me as we go in search of the red-cockaded woodpecker and in search of a better understanding of this uncommon but controversial bird. This program is about a land unknown to many people, a land that in many ways has escaped the hustle and bustle of modern civilization, a place with bountiful backcountry, forests, streams, and wildlife more diverse than can be found in much of the inhabited world. Come along with me as we explore the natural wonders of this land. Come along as we discover Alabama. Welcome to Discovering Alabama. Today we're several miles back in the Talladega National Forest, in a part of the forest that's especially suitable for the red-cockaded woodpecker. The bird was placed on the federal list of endangered species back in the 1970s, and ever since then it's been a source of growing concern across its range, from Texas east to Florida and north up near Virginia. Of course, people have been interested in woodpeckers for years. The classic image of the woodpecker is a zany, colorful character whose noisy habits are hard to miss. No wonder then that some early cultures were as fascinated with the bird as we are. Archaeologists have uncovered ancient Native American artifacts, many from right here in Alabama, that are decorated with the image of the woodpecker. It seems the bird may have been an honored symbol of strength, health, and spiritual well-being. When you look at how well the bird is adapted to its environment, that reverence is not hard to understand. The most obvious adaptation is the beak. Its wedge shape works well as a pick when ripping or chipping, and as a drill when making small, deep holes directly into insect burrows. But just boring into an insect burrow doesn't bring home the meal. For that, the bird uses an extensible tongue, which not only reaches well beyond the end of the beak, but is barbed for good measure. And to hold on to the side of a tree, the bird has opposed claws, 2 in front and 2 in back. These combine with strong, spiny tail feathers that act as a prop and added support when the birds are climbing, resting, or drilling. There are about 250 woodpecker species worldwide. Roughly 50 of those are native to the U.S., and 8 species make their home here in Alabama. These open piney woods are just the kind of place our bird likes. Now, if we check the bird guide again, we find the red-cockaded woodpecker, species name Cockaded borealis, doesn't fit the typical image of a woodpecker. It's not very big, only 6 or 7 inches in length, no protruding crest, and there's our friend now. You can see it's not an especially noticeable bird. And surprise, it doesn't have a red head, not even any flashy red markings. So why the name red-cockaded woodpecker? It seems the bird was named around the time of the Civil War. Confederate soldiers distinguished their rank with a cockade on the side of their hats. And if you look closely, you'll see the male of the species sports a small red cockade on the side of its head. Now you might think we'd find woodpeckers in this kind of tree. But the red-cockaded is unique among woodpeckers. It's the only woodpecker that excavates its den in a living tree, a living pine tree to be exact. It seems the birds learned that a den in a living pine would offer protection from fire as well as from other predators. It may take the birds 5 years to excavate their den, but this valuable piece of property is passed down from one generation to another. There are some dens that have been in continuous use for 50 years or more. The birds live in a family unit called a clan, which consists of a breeding pair and several male offspring from previous nestings. These are called helpers because they assist in incubating the eggs, in feeding the young, and excavating new nests. As the birds excavate their nest cavity, they chip away the bark for up to several feet above and below the cavity. Then the birds drill holes all around the cavity to allow the resin to flow. Remember, they prefer a living tree. Eventually, enough resin coats all around the hole to make the tree look from a distance a lot like a candle. In fact, some think that this conspicuous resin area, called the plate, serves as a territorial warning to other birds. Another function of the resin is to deter predators. Rat snakes, for example, will actively avoid the stuff. So the red-cockaded woodpecker likes large open tracts of pine forest, and without a lot of understory to clutter the immediate living area. So, we've got a unique species here. In addition to special habits like using pine sap to protect its den, the red-cockaded woodpecker is a family bird. It has a fairly complex social structure, and it needs a special kind of home in which to live. It's that home that causes some of the problems. The bird can excavate its nest only in a pine tree that has softened heartwood. In fact, the trees usually have red heart disease, a fungus that softens the heart but doesn't kill the rest of the tree. This cross-section comes from a longleaf pine, a favorite den tree for the red-cockaded woodpecker. Now, trees that get red heart disease are usually old, 60, 70 years and more. And, well, today we usually harvest these fellows before they get that old. In fact, true old-growth forests are pretty much a thing of the past. For example, the Southeast was once covered with nearly 100 million acres of old-growth longleaf pine forest. But today, only a couple thousand acres remain, and a few small tracts scattered about the region. This loss of native old-growth forest is something that has taken place over several hundred years. As that forest gradually disappeared, so did many native ecosystems and the scores of creatures that inhabited them. And only recently have we become conscious of the environmental damage that's been done. Until about 1950, Alabama was home to one of the most impressive woodpecker species, the ivory-billed woodpecker. The ivory-billed was one of the largest woodpeckers in the world, almost 2 feet in length, with a large white patch on its back and a long, glossy beak. This uniquely strong and hardy bird had a singular preference for the vast wild woodlands that once prevailed along the rivers and swamps of the Southeast. But these deep forest solitudes were also inviting to another species, one with a ravenous appetite for timber. As civilization advanced, large tracts of native forest were cut to supply the needs of a growing country. Virgin woodlands disappeared, and so did the ivory-billed woodpecker. By 1950, there were no more. The species vanished from the continent, its memory preserved by only a few minutes of rare old film. The fate of the ivory-billed woodpecker may have been prevented if more had been understood about its specialized habits and needs. The same could be said for many species now extinct. we fail to appreciate their needs and their habits and the potential benefits to the environment and to us. But today, expanding human activity is rapidly altering the natural world and causing a great increase in the rate of extinction. Scientists estimate that worldwide we may be losing several species each day. Ultimately, this loss threatens the health of whole ecosystems. The endangered status of the red-cockaded woodpecker, then, can be seen as a gauge of the status of the ecosystem. How do we preserve an endangered species and its ecosystem, which holds one kind of benefit for us? And at the same time, how do we keep an industry viable, which holds another kind of benefit for us? The issues around the red-cockaded woodpecker are often presented as a simple conflict between preservation and profit, the kind of thing you might hear on the 6 o'clock news. The red-cockaded woodpecker is called the spotted owl of the South, and some say protecting the bird means a lockup of valuable timber, reduction of commercial harvest, and the loss of jobs. But when you look at the history of the bird and the ecosystem it calls home, the problem's not that simple. Nowhere in North America are there as many electrical storms as there are in the Southeast. And until the intervention of man, nowhere were there as many lightning-started forest fires. Southern pines and the critters that live in the southern pine ecosystem have learned to live and even thrive with that fire. But every road cut through the forest has become a firebreak, stopping the natural spread of fire and limiting the cleansing, clearing effect it has on the landscape.
The southern pines are tolerant of the fire. Not only are they tolerant of it, they promote it. Their needles are full of resins, and they carry a fast fire through the forest. As a result, the fire doesn't kill the pines, but it does kill the hardwood trees, or many of them. The red-cockaded woodpecker and the pine forest ecosystem today are ecosystems and endangered species that cannot exist without man introducing fire.
So let's debunk a myth here. This is not an issue of preserving the wilderness, of keeping the wilderness free from human disturbance. The forest must be managed to protect the red-cockaded woodpecker. The real disagreement is over exactly how that management should take place.
I think one of the most critical factors right now is the way in which the forests are being managed. We know enough about this bird to know what it needs. It's a very social bird. It requires large tracts of land. It uses, on average, about 200 acres of forest in its foraging. Clear cutting, which is the current management tool, which I disagree with, will all of a sudden take part of that 200 acres. And as a result, the birds have to move elsewhere. And in moving elsewhere, they may be moving into the home range of another clan. And we find that the placement of clear cuts is extremely crucial. It can cause the extinction of colonies, even though it's not near the colony site.
We're continuing to harvest timber with even-aged management using clear cutting. However, we are managing to protect elements, habitat elements that are critical to the bird's existence. The Francis Marion National Forest in South Carolina had documented increases in red-cockaded woodpecker populations while even-aged management with clear cutting was continuing. That increase was very well documented because that forest was being very intensively studied.
You know, there have been some short-term studies done that suggest that clear cutting is good for red-cockaded woodpeckers. Find a few colony sites, go in and put some clear cuts there, and the next year go back, and sure, the birds will probably still be nesting there. But this is a bird that has a lag time in its population cycle. Those birds will hang on. I mean, that's home to them. They're not going to leave. They'll hang on till they die, even if they can't get enough food to feed their young, even if they can't get females dispersing into the area. Long-term studies are important. Conclusions based on a single year or a couple years are pure garbage.
Do you have to have old forest? There's quite a bit of controversy over that. Here in the South, we do not need that. There's no question in my mind. You can recover woodpeckers, clear cutting, appropriately used in terms of stand size and distribution of cuts, and making considerations for how much habitat must be in foraging condition, how much habitat must be in colony condition, you can increase numbers of woodpeckers with those silvicultural strategies. Some think that you can't. I disagree.
Such a tiny bird to cause so large a controversy. Whatever the complexities, the age of the tree, the size of the foraging area, to clear cut or not, a simple fact arises. The red-cockaded woodpecker's best chance for survival is in places with a lot of forest. Now, Alabama is blessed with forest land, around 23 million acres, 2/3 of the state. Some of this land is federal, but most, better than 95%, is privately owned. The government has no direct participation in how private owners manage their lands, but the Endangered Species Act makes it illegal for anyone to damage the nesting or foraging area of the red-cockaded woodpecker. And there's the rub. And it's a rub that's been grabbing some headlines.
Take, for example, the landowner that owns 80 acres. And he is nurturing that forest over the years in order to have the money to send his child to college. And the red-cockaded woodpecker shows up about a year before he's ready to sell the timber to send his child to college. Society should not require that landowner to bear the expense of protecting the red-cockaded woodpecker, which is a value that society needs to assume responsibility for. The Endangered Species Act is in the process of being reauthorized. It is in need of modification so that it achieves its objectives in such fashion as to protect the rights of property owners and not take those rights without due process and just compensation, as in fact as is guaranteed in the 5th and 14th Amendments of the Constitutions of the United States.
Of course, everyone understands what the intent of these regulations were when they were originally written and why we need guidelines to protect endangered species. But in protecting those species, landowners are finding increasingly that they are losing their economic values from their property.
On private lands, we've had some real catastrophes. I don't think the Endangered Species Act in the case of the red-cockaded should be applied to a small landowner, somebody with 200 acres who depends on that land for a livelihood, and it turns out he's got a red-cockaded woodpecker colony there, unless we're willing to step in and subsidize him for the wildlife use.
There have been a few cases when landowners have suffered under the provisions of the Endangered Species Act, and we should address the need for compensation when this applies. But let's debunk another myth. This issue is not about whether it's important to protect endangered species. Experts are unanimous that it's very important. And wildlife officials are developing programs to capture and relocate red-cockaded woodpeckers at no cost to the small landowner.
It's certainly true that there are strong feelings on both sides of the issue of the red-cockaded woodpecker problem, but both sides are overblowing way out of proportion the magnitude of the problem. There are no serious problems in Alabama with red-cockaded woodpeckers on private lands, and we are in the process of developing a program through cooperation with the Fish and Wildlife Service, a habitat conservation plan for private lands statewide in Alabama that would allow us to live trap fledgling birds from red-cockaded woodpecker colonies and translocate them to federal land. We feel this is good for biology for the birds to get them all together, and it's relief of a concern for the landowner.
These relocated birds end up on federal land, which includes military installations as well as national forests, parks, and wildlife refuges. There, members of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are trying to do more than just maintain the bird. They're trying to expand and recover the red-cockaded woodpecker population to the point where the bird is no longer endangered. Woodpeckers are banded and tracked to expand our base of knowledge. In some instances, artificial cavities are drilled to provide an instant living space. These efforts are slowly bringing the bird back from the brink of extinction. At the same time, large corporate landowners have taken some very positive steps towards managing woodpecker habitat to maintain the bird.
It does turn out that corporate lands do support a lot of these creatures, more so than do very small landowners. Therefore, corporate ownership often can do more for listed species in terms of their flexibility to work around certain situations and provide habitat in a reasonable manner. It is minimum profit sacrifice.
We are working today and hopefully will sign within the next month or so a significant document with the Georgia-Pacific Corporation dealing with how they are going to deal with red-cockaded woodpecker management on their corporate lands.
This is an unprecedented agreement in terms of the level of cooperation, the 4 million acres of timberland that it covers, in terms of seeking a balance between the imperative to create jobs in forest production, the imperative to protect the environment.
Georgia-Pacific has recognized their responsibilities to some level, take care of red-cockaded woodpeckers, and the level they've chosen to adopt is a maintenance level.
Major timber companies, I think they have a public responsibility to do some positive management for the birds. And I think the contributions to be made by private industry would be best made if coordinated so that we developed corridors of good habitat, corridors along which birds could move and populations could move from one major area to another. We need the diversity of colony sites that we will get with having some on federal, some on state, and some on private.
The person with 60 acres of woodpeckers is not the same as Georgia-Pacific, with 3.5 million acres of woodpeckers. So, and I'm trying to treat those different landowners more equitably. And I think for the small landowner, that means taking the problem away from them of woodpeckers and what that might mean for habitat. For big landowners, that means hopefully having them recognize some environmental ethic and building on that.
Now we know we can't extract timber or harvest crops from the land without those actions affecting other species. But those effects don't have to be devastating. We can search for strategies that promote the welfare of our own species and maintain the welfare of other creatures.
The bottom line is, though, that we're talking not just about a woodpecker, but a whole ecosystem. There are several endangered species found in this ecosystem. We're looking at one of those species, and by managing it, we're managing for the others too. The health of the ecosystem is going to affect the health of the environments in which man lives. And I think the bottom line is that we have to do this for us as well as for the birds.
It happens that there's no evidence, at least, that any other species considers the well-being of its ecological associates other than man. No other species has ever had the ability to consider its past or work at estimating or predicting its future.
We're beginning to understand that because humanity really has lived for thousands or even millions of years in natural environments teeming with as many different kinds of organisms, vital to their existence during most of that time, that human beings today need it in a deep psychological, even spiritual sense. So we should be thinking more and more about saving plants and animals and natural ecosystems as part of our heritage.
There are intangible benefits to saving an endangered species, to preserving a threatened ecosystem. But there may be tangible benefits as well. Benefits from nature that we have yet to discover. A new drug to cure cancer, a new protein to prevent heart disease, a new enzyme to relieve arthritis. So when we preserve a species, we preserve our own options for the future. We give ourselves an opportunity to enhance our own well-being. On a broader scale, the interconnectedness of it all is significant. Individual species function as the biological nuts and bolts that hold together larger ecosystems. If we sustain this overall biological diversity, then we sustain the larger ecosystems. And the ecosystems can continue in turn to sustain life on Earth. We hope you enjoyed our show this time. Please send any comments to Discovering Alabama, care of the Alabama Museum of Natural History, Box 870340, University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, 35487.
This program is supported by grants from Gulf States Paper Corporation, the Alabama Forest Resources Center, promoting education and cooperation for all the benefits of proper forest management, the Robert G. Whaley Charitable Trust, the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and Legacy, Partners in Environmental Education.